I discovered my family's silent struggle and how we rebuilt our boned Reddit stories. The world often views families through a rosy lens, assuming that the ties between members are always harmonious, loving, and unbreakable. But the truth is far from this idealized picture. Families are complicated, filled with both silent moments of understanding and loud eruptions of conflict. The heart of any family lies not in the perfection of its members, but in their ability to navigate the quiet spaces between words, the unsaid gestures, and the bonds that form despite, or perhaps because, their differences. In the heart of a small, quiet town lived a family that seemed perfect to the outside world. The Johnsons, a seemingly ordinary family, appeared to embody an ideal picture of love and happiness. A father who worked tirelessly to provide for his family, a mother who was the epitome of grace and patience, and two children who excelled in everything they did. But beneath the surface, there were secrets, deep, unspoken truths that everyone in the family carried and no one dared to voice. The story begins with Sarah Johnson, the eldest child, who had always felt like she was carrying the weight of her family's expectations. At 23, she had already graduated college with honors, landed a well-paying job, and maintained the perfect relationship with her high school sweetheart, Jason. On paper, Sarah had everything going for her. But in reality, she felt like a shell of herself, trying to fit into a mold that her parents had created long before she had even learned to walk. Her mother, a woman of grace and charm, had always expected perfection. Nothing was ever good enough. And her father, though a kind man, often displayed his affection in ways that felt distant and cold. His silence was often mistaken for strength, but to Sarah, it felt like a heavy burden, one that spoke volumes without ever uttering a word. Sarah's younger brother, Daniel, was the opposite. A 19-year-old with a rebellious streak, Daniel had never cared much for the expectations placed upon him. While Sarah was the golden child, he was the one who constantly pushed boundaries. He didn't care about school or what anyone thought about him. His world revolved around skateboarding, music, and the friends who accepted him for who he was rather than what he could achieve. Yet, despite his carefree attitude, Daniel too was hiding a secret, a dark one which he'd never dared to speak about to anyone, not even his sister. It was on one of those quiet Sunday afternoons, when the Johnsons gathered in their cozy living room to share a meal, that the cracks in their perfect facade began to show. The conversation started innocently enough, as most family dinners do. The usual chatter about work, school, and the upcoming holidays. But it was when Sarah asked about their upcoming family vacation that the tension began to rise. It was a trip they had planned for months. Something to bring them all closer together. But to Sarah, the trip felt more like an obligation than a genuine desire to spend time with each other. "We've all been looking forward to this, right?" Sarah asked, trying to sound excited, though the words felt empty as soon as they left her lips. Her mother, Margaret, looked up from her plate, her eyes meeting Sarah's for just a moment before she looked away. "Oh, of course," Margaret replied, her voice laced with a sweetness that Sarah had long grown accustomed to, though it never quite reached her eyes. "It will be wonderful. The entire family together, just like old times." Old times, Sarah muttered under her breath, only half aware that Daniel had heard her. He raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. They both knew what cold times meant, times when their family still pretended to be close, when their father still smiled and laughed with them before things started changing. Before Sarah began to feel like a stranger in her own home. "I think I'll pass on the trip," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. It was an unusual statement coming from him, especially since he had been the one to suggest family vacations in the past, albeit with a touch of sarcasm. The room went silent as everyone turned to him, surprised by his sudden change of heart. "Daniel, why would you say that?" their father, Thomas, asked, his tone more confused than angry. "I just don't think it's the right time," Daniel replied, avoiding his father's gaze. "I've got plans." "What plans?" Margaret asked, trying to keep the situation light. "You know how important this is for the family. We've all been looking forward to this." "I know," Daniel said, his voice tinged with frustration. "But I just can't do it right now. I need some space, space." The word hung in the air, heavier than any silence that had come before. It was a word that Sarah had used countless times in her own mind when she wanted to escape the suffocating expectations of her family. But Daniel, the wild card of the family, had finally voiced it. He wanted space. Space from them. Space from the suffocating bonds that kept him tied to this picture, perfect family that never truly existed. Margaret sighed deeply, pushing her plate away. "This is not like you, Daniel. You're part of this family, and we need to be together, especially now." Daniel stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I never signed up for this, Mom. I never asked for your perfect family or your perfect expectations. You don't even know me," he shouted, his voice rising with anger. Sarah watched in stunned silence as her mother's face paled, and her father clenched his jaw, as though he were trying to hold back something more than just anger. It was the first time in years that anyone in the family had spoken so openly about their feelings, and yet it felt more like a betrayal than a breakthrough. The room grew colder as the tension thickened. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She had always been the good daughter, the one who kept her emotions in check, the one who never dared to rock the boat. But now, as she watched her brother storm out of the room, her own feelings began to surface. Feelings that she had buried for years. She had always known there was something wrong with their family. They were all so different, so distant, even though they lived under the same roof. But it wasn't until that moment that Sarah realized the truth. Their family was never perfect. It was an illusion they had all bought into, an illusion that had kept them trapped in a cycle of unspoken resentment and untold secrets. And as Sarah sat there, her heart aching with the realization, she knew one thing for sure. Everything was about to change. The quiet facade of their family was starting to crack, and there was no turning back. The unspoken bonds, once so tight and invisible, were now being tested in ways none of them could have ever predicted. As the door slammed shut behind Daniel, the weight of his words lingered in the air, echoing in the silence that followed. Sarah's mind raced. What if she had said something sooner? What if they had all been honest with each other from the beginning? Would things have turned out differently? But there were no answers, only questions. And with each passing moment, the walls between them grew higher and thicker, making it harder to reach out, to understand each other. What had once been a family bound by love was now a family bound by unspoken truths. Truths that would either tear them apart or bring them closer than they had ever been before. The days following Daniel's outburst were filled with an uneasy quiet. The family went about their routines, but the air was thick with unspoken words and lingering tension. Sarah, though she had always tried to maintain the peace, found herself pulled in different directions. On one hand, she wanted to be the glue that held them all together. She wanted to fix everything, to make it right, to patch up the cracks that had begun to appear in their seemingly perfect family. On the other hand, there was a part of her, one that had been growing for years, that was tired of pretending, tired of carrying the burden of expectations, tired of smiling through the discomfort, and most of all, tired of keeping her own feelings buried deep inside. Her father, Thomas, had retreated into his work. He often stayed late at the office, his briefcases and papers scattered around the house as though they were the only things that could anchor him in this sea of uncertainty. He was a man who had built his life on control, on providing for his family in ways that he thought mattered, and in staying strong for everyone around him. But now, with his family unraveling, the weight of his own silence became even heavier. He had always thought that by being the stoic, strong father, he could protect them from the world's chaos. But in reality, his silence had only built walls between them, walls that were now difficult to tear down. Margaret, on the other hand, was in denial. She kept herself busy with trivial tasks around the house, organizing the pantry, arranging the laundry, scrubbing countertops. Anything to avoid facing the growing rift between her children, between her family. She clung to the idea of normalcy, convincing herself that if she just kept everything neat and in its place, things would somehow work themselves out. But deep down, she knew it wasn't true. She knew that they were all struggling in their own way, and that the perfect family image she had so desperately tried to maintain had been shattered, perhaps beyond repair. For days, Sarah felt as if she were standing in the middle of a storm with no way to reach the calm center. She had tried calling Daniel a few times, but he hadn't picked up. Her attempts to talk to her mother were met with empty reassurances that everything would be fine, that this was just a phase, and that they would all move past it. But Sarah knew better. She knew that they were all hiding from something, and it wasn't going to go away until they faced it. One evening, as the sun began to set and the house grew quiet, Sarah found herself alone in the living room. Her mind wandered back to the dinner table, to the moment when Daniel had shouted his frustration. The way he had stormed off, the look in her father's eyes when he couldn't find the words to respond. It all felt so surreal. She had never seen Daniel so angry, so raw. He had always been the one to hide behind a mask of indifference, the one who avoided confrontation at all costs. But now, it seemed like he was finally breaking free from the chains that had kept him trapped. Her thoughts were interrupted when the front door creaked open. It was Daniel. He had come home. Sarah's heart raced as she stood up, unsure of what to say or do. She had wanted this moment, had longed for it in the days since their argument, but now that it was here, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. What if things couldn't be fixed? What if they were too far gone? Daniel's footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. He walked into the living room, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something to latch onto. His expression was unreadable, but there was something different about him, something that made Sarah's chest tighten. "I'm not staying long," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "I just need to grab my stuff." Sarah took a tentative step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel, we need to talk." He paused, his gaze flickering toward her before he sighed and dropped his backpack onto the couch. "I don't want to talk." "Sarah, I really don't." "Please," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I know things are messed up right now, but we can't just keep ignoring it. I don't want us to fall apart like this." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, looking at her, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Then, with a sharp exhale, he spoke again. "You don't get it, Sarah. You don't understand what it's like to be stuck in this family where nothing is ever enough. Where no matter what you do, you're always second to your perfect little life. I'm not you. I don't care about grades or achievements or whatever else. I just want to be myself. But I can't do that here." Sarah felt a pang in her chest at his words. He was right. She had always been the one to seek approval, to make sure everything was just right. She had spent so many years trying to be perfect in her parents' eyes that she had never truly stopped to ask herself what she wanted. What Daniel was saying was the truth, even if it hurt to hear. "I didn't mean to make you feel like that," she said softly. "But it's not just about being perfect. It's about trying to live up to something that you don't even know is possible." Daniel's eyes softened, but his tone remained defensive. "You don't get it. It's not about living up to anything. It's about living for yourself, not for them. Not for their expectations." "I know," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "I know. But it's hard. It's hard to change everything we've been taught. To stop pretending." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, laden with years of unspoken words and misunderstood intentions. But as the seconds passed, something shifted in the air. It was as if the weight of the years of silence had finally begun to lift, if only for a moment. And in that moment, Sarah realized that this conversation, this confrontation, was just the beginning. It wasn't the end, but it was the first step towards something else. "We need to talk to Mom and Dad," Sarah said quietly. "We can't fix this if we keep pretending it's not happening. We need to tell them the truth. All of it." Daniel looked at her, his eyes searching hers for something. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was fear. "Do you think they'll listen?" Sarah swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the question settle in her stomach. "I don't know, but we have to try." For the first time in days, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, their family could find its way back to each other. Or at the very least, they could begin the process of rebuilding. The following week passed in a blur, a mixture of tension and quiet anticipation. The air in the Johnson household had shifted, no longer just thick with unsaid words, but now charged with the weight of the inevitable conversation. Sarah had never known silence to feel so deafening, and as the days drew on, she could feel herself bracing for the moment when they would finally confront the truth that had been buried for far too long. Sarah had been planning the conversation for days, her mind racing with a million thoughts. How should they start? What should they say? Would their parents even listen, or would it all fall apart? She had been organizing her thoughts into a coherent speech, but every time she tried to put it into words, it felt inadequate. How could she encapsulate years of unspoken resentment, expectations, and frustration into a few sentences? That Friday evening, after dinner, the family was sitting together in the living room, each person lost in their own thoughts. Sarah had been dreading this moment, yet she knew it was time. Daniel sat on the arm of the couch, his body language still closed off, his eyes flicking between Sarah and their parents. Margaret was flipping through a magazine, pretending to be busy, while Thomas was reading through some paperwork, his focus so intense that he barely seemed aware of the family around him. "Mom, Dad," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly. She had rehearsed it so many times, but now that the moment had come, her nerves were getting the best of her. "We need to talk." Margaret didn't look up from her magazine, but Thomas put down the papers and turned his attention to Sarah. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that almost looked like resignation. But he said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "About what happened last week?" Sarah pressed on. "About what Daniel said. About everything." Her mother sighed, the sound almost inaudible, but Sarah caught it. It was a sound that spoke of years of frustration, of too many things left unsaid. Margaret finally set the magazine down, her gaze drifting toward Sarah. "Sarah, we've already talked about this. Daniel's just going through a phase. He'll get over it." Sarah felt a pang of frustration rising inside her. "Mom, it's not just a phase. We've been pretending for so long that everything is fine. But it's not. It's not fine." Thomas looked at his daughter, his brow furrowed, but he remained silent. The tension in the room thickened. Sarah could feel the weight of her words, but she knew she couldn't stop now. Not after everything that had happened. "I've been holding on to this for a long time," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to say this, but I don't feel like I belong here anymore. I don't feel like I ever did. There are so many expectations that I've been trying to live up to, but they're not mine. They've always been your expectations, Mom, Dad. I've spent my entire life trying to be the perfect daughter, trying to make you proud, but I've never felt like I could be myself, not once." Daniel shifted uncomfortably on the arm of the couch, but he didn't interrupt. His eyes met Sarah's, and for the first time in a long time, she saw a flicker of understanding there. He knew. He had always known. Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Thomas didn't speak immediately. Instead, he looked at his daughter, his face a mixture of concern and something else. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe regret. Margaret, on the other hand, looked stunned, as if Sarah's words had caught her completely off guard. "I don't understand," Margaret finally said, her voice tight. "You've always done so well in school, in life. You've always made us proud. Why would you feel that way?" "Because I've been pretending," Sarah replied, her voice a little stronger now. "I've been pretending to be something I'm not, and I'm tired of it." Thomas stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "That's not true, Sarah. We've always been proud of you. You've achieved so much. Don't you see that?" "I don't see anything," Sarah said, standing up as well. "I don't see any of it. I see a family that doesn't talk about the things that really matter. I see a family that avoids confrontation at all costs, even when it's destroying us." Her words struck like a hammer. Margaret recoiled slightly, as though she had been physically hit. Thomas's expression hardened, but Sarah could see the pain in his eyes. He wanted to say something, but his voice faltered. He couldn't find the words. Daniel, who had been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. "It's not just Sarah, you know. I've been feeling the same way for years. I don't belong here. I don't fit into this perfect little world that you've built. I don't care about your expectations, and I never will." Thomas's face darkened at his son's words, but instead of yelling, he looked defeated, as if he had already lost this battle before it had even begun. "Daniel, you're just going through a phase. You're angry, and that's okay. But you'll come to your senses," Thomas said, his voice firm, though tinged with uncertainty. "No?" Daniel shot back, his voice low but insistent. "It's not just a phase. I've been saying this for years, and no one's ever listened. I don't care about school or your career or your perfect life. I just want to be myself. And you don't even know who I am." Margaret finally broke down, her face crumpling with emotion. "What do you want from us, Daniel? We've done everything for you. We've given you everything." "I don't want anything from you," Daniel said, his voice softer now. "I just want to stop feeling like I'm living someone else's life." Sarah could see that her brother's anger had softened, replaced with something else. Hurt, maybe, or a deep longing for something he had never felt he could express. She felt a pang in her chest, realizing that for years, they had both been carrying the same pain, just in different ways. "We don't know what you want, Daniel," Thomas said, his voice quiet now, regret creeping into his words. We don't know what you're going through." "But you never asked," Daniel whispered. The words hit harder than anything else, and in that moment, Sarah realized how true they were. Their parents had never asked. They had assumed that if they kept things running smoothly, kept their children on the right track, everything would work itself out. But they had never once stopped to ask how their children were truly feeling, what they were truly going through. "I want us to be a family," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I want us to be real. I want us to stop pretending that everything is perfect, because it's not. We're all hurting, and we need to talk about it." Thomas took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he looked between his children. For the first time in what felt like forever, he looked vulnerable, unsure. Margaret wiped her eyes, her expression softening. "I don't know how to fix this," Thomas said quietly. "But I want to try. I don't want to lose any of you." Sarah felt a rush of emotion. The words she had been waiting to hear for so long were finally being spoken, but they were also the hardest to hear. This was the moment when everything could change, but it wouldn't be easy. No one had the answers, and no one had the perfect solution. But for the first time, they were all willing to face the truth, however painful it was. And in that fragile moment, as the air seemed to crackle with possibility, Sarah realized that they weren't just a family falling apart. They were a family in the process of rebuilding one conversation, one painful truth at a time. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be real. And for the first time in years, that was enough. The weeks following the conversation that had shattered the silence in the Johnson household were a blur of conflicting emotions. It was as though a dam had been broken, and the floodwaters of long-hidden frustrations, doubts, and desires had begun to rush out. There were moments of clarity, of connection, but also moments where the weight of the past seemed almost unbearable. The process of rebuilding, Sarah quickly realized, wasn't just about talking. It was about doing, about changing old habits and confronting the things that had been avoided for so long. In the days after their conversation, nothing changed immediately. There were no sudden breakthroughs, no quick fixes. Thomas, once the solid pillar of the family, seemed lost in his own mind, unsure of how to proceed. Margaret, her world of routines and neatness, was shaken to her core, unsure how to react now that the perfect image of their family had been so dramatically fractured. Daniel had retreated even further, his rebellious streak now tinged with a sense of resignation. But Sarah, despite the aching tension that lingered in the house, felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time, they had faced the truth. They were no longer pretending that everything was fine, and maybe that was the first real step toward healing. Sarah spent hours after school or work in the living room, a place that once felt suffocating but now seemed like the only space that could hold the weight of their conversation. There were still awkward silences during family dinners, moments where no one knew what to say or how to say it. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that change was slowly starting to creep in. One Thursday evening, as Sarah prepared to eat dinner alone, her mother had been out with friends, and Daniel had once again disappeared into his room. Thomas finally sat down beside her at the dinner table. It was the first time in weeks that he had intentionally sought her out. He looked worn, his usual stoic expression softened with what Sarah could only describe as vulnerability. "I've been thinking about what you said," Thomas began, his voice low and hesitant. "About how I've always kept my distance, how I never really listened to you or Daniel. I've been thinking about that a lot." Sarah put down her fork, her heart racing. She had waited for this moment, for her father to acknowledge what had been left unspoken for so long. But finally hearing it from him, was still a shock. "I don't know how to fix it," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to do to make things better. But I want to try. I don't want to lose my family. Sarah." The words felt like a lifeline. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she looked at him, searching for some sign that he truly meant what he was saying. The father, who had always been so distant, so focused on providing and protecting, was now admitting his flaws. It was the first time she had ever seen him so open, so willing to be vulnerable. "I know, Dad," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to lose us either." The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that now felt different, one filled with understanding, with the acknowledgement that things needed to change. For the first time, they had opened the door to rebuilding. But as much as Sarah wanted to believe that things could just magically get better, she knew that there was more work to be done. Conversations like these couldn't be one-time events. They couldn't just be a cathartic release of emotions. They had to be ongoing. And the real challenge was not in the talking, but in the living. Daniel's return home that evening brought a familiar tension back into the house. Sarah could feel it as soon as he walked through the door. His defiance, the way he carried himself as though he were a stranger in his own home. The moment their eyes met, she saw the flicker of something familiar in his gaze: anger, frustration, and a quiet yearning for connection. "You're back early," she remarked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, I figured I'd check in," Daniel muttered, tossing his bag onto the couch before sitting down. His tone was sharp, but there was a wariness in it that Sarah hadn't noticed before. "You're not mad anymore, are you?" she asked, choosing her words carefully. "Mad?" Daniel let out a short laugh. "I'm not mad. I'm just tired of pretending, you know?" Sarah nodded, understanding more than he realized. They had both been pretending for so long that it had become second nature. But pretending was no longer an option. "Maybe pretending was the problem," Sarah said, her voice steady. "Maybe we all need to stop pretending to be something we're not." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He just stared at the floor, his fingers tapping on the armrest of the couch. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they had yet to say. "It's not just about pretending," Daniel finally said, his voice quiet. "It's about feeling like I'm not part of this family. I don't fit in here. It's like I'm just a guest in my own home, and no one even notices." Sarah felt a pang of guilt at his words. She had been so caught up in her own struggles, her own need for approval, that she hadn't seen how much Daniel was hurting. He had always been the one to act out, to push boundaries, and she had mistaken his behavior for mere rebellion. But now she saw the truth. He was just as lost, just as uncertain as she was. "I see that now," she said softly. "I see how hard it's been for you. I'm sorry I never really understood before." Daniel looked up at her, his expression softening for the first time in weeks. "I just want to be seen, Sarah. I want to be seen for who I am, not who you want me to be." "I see you," she replied, her voice filled with conviction. "And I don't want you to change for anyone. Not for Mom, not for Dad, not for me. Just be you." Daniel's lips twitched into something like a smile, but it was fleeting. "I don't know if I can, "You don't have to know," Sarah said, her heart swelling with empathy. "You just have to try." That night, after a long and emotional conversation, Sarah felt a shift. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough to make her believe that they were on the right path. For the first time in years, they were no longer hiding from the truth. They were no longer hiding from each other, but there was still a long way to go. The road ahead would be filled with difficult conversations, uncomfortable moments, and plenty of setbacks. There would be times when they would want to fall back into old habits, when the weight of the past would threaten to pull them under. But Sarah believed, with everything in her, that they could do it. They could rebuild what had been broken piece by piece. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being real. About facing the messy, complicated truth of who they were and choosing to love each other anyway. And in that moment, Sarah realized that, for the first time in her life, she was no longer afraid of the truth. She was no longer afraid of the mess. She was ready to face whatever came next, no matter how hard it might be. Because the only way forward, she now understood, was together. As the months passed, the Johnsons continued their journey toward healing, but the road was not as smooth as Sarah had hoped. Rebuilding a family was not a linear process. It was messy, it was painful, and it required constant effort. But Sarah, for the first time in her life, found herself willing to put in that effort. She had been so caught up in the idea of perfection before, striving for an ideal family dynamic that didn't exist. Now, she was learning to accept that families, like people, were imperfect, and that imperfection was where true connection could thrive. It was a Sunday afternoon when Sarah first noticed the change in her mother. Margaret had always been the picture of poise and order, a woman who took pride in keeping everything neat and controlled. But on this particular Sunday, as she prepared dinner in the kitchen, Sarah saw a softness in her mother's eyes, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Margaret was chopping vegetables, a simple task, but there was a tenderness in the way she moved, almost as though she was learning to find joy in the small, everyday moments rather than worrying about keeping up appearances. "I think we should take a break from all the tension," Margaret said, her voice carrying a hint of something new. Something like hope. "Maybe we should go on that trip we've been planning. Just the four of us. Not for the holidays or anything special, but just for us to spend some time together. No expectations. Just being a family." Sarah was taken aback by her mother's suggestion. It wasn't something Margaret would normally say. Family vacations had always been about keeping up with appearances, making sure they looked like the perfect family in public. But now, It seemed like her mother was suggesting something different, something real. "I'd like that," Sarah replied, her voice quiet but sincere. "It sounds like a good idea." Margaret smiled softly, nodding as if to herself. "We've all been so caught up in our own lives lately, pretending that everything's fine when it's not. Maybe it's time we let go of the need to be perfect." Other words hung in the air, a subtle shift in the fabric of their family's dynamic. It wasn't just about the trip. It was about the realization that they could let go of the need to pretend. They could simply be together. They didn't need to be anything more than themselves. The following weekend, the family packed up their things and drove to a small cabin in the woods. The place was quiet, secluded, and untouched by the chaos of everyday life. It was exactly what they needed, a space to reconnect, to breathe, and to finally start mending the broken parts of their relationship. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she had been on a trip like this with her family. It felt both strange and comforting, like returning to a time she had forgotten. There were no agendas, no distractions, just the four of them sitting around a fire pit, talking in a way they hadn't in years. The evening started out awkwardly, with everyone unsure of how to act. Daniel, as usual, was the first to break the silence, his defiance still present but softened by the quiet of the cabin. "So, I guess we're just going to sit here and pretend this is a normal family vacation, huh?" But there was no defensiveness in his voice this time, only a hint of humor. Sarah smiled, realizing that he was slowly beginning to drop the walls he had spent so long building. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. "You know," Thomas said, breaking his usual silence, "I've been thinking. Maybe we've all been doing this wrong. Maybe we've been so focused on trying to fix everything that we've forgotten how to just enjoy being together." "Duh," Margaret nodded in agreement. "I don't think we've ever really taken the time to appreciate each other, to just be in the moment. Everything's always been about getting things done, about checking off lists, about looking perfect. Maybe that's not what matters." For the first time in as long as Sarah could remember, her father seemed genuinely open, genuinely engaged in the conversation. He wasn't the stoic, distant figure he had always been. He was just a man, sitting by the fire, talking about the things that really mattered. "I think we've all been afraid of something," Sarah said, her voice quieter now. "Afraid of being vulnerable, of letting go of the expectations. Afraid of what happens if we stop pretending." Daniel shifted in his seat, his eyes flickering to Sarah. "You know, I never really understood why you always tried to be perfect. It seemed so exhausting." Sarah laughed softly, the sound almost unfamiliar to her own ears. "I guess it was. But I think I was just trying to keep everything together. I didn't know how to be real with you all. And now I'm learning that maybe that's okay. Maybe it's okay to not have everything figured out, but." The conversation continued into the night, flowing more easily now, as though the walls that had once stood between them were beginning to crumble. Sarah could see it in her mother's eyes. The realization that the image of the perfect family was nothing more than a facade. There was no need for perfection. There was only the messy, beautiful reality of being together. Over the next few days, the family enjoyed the simple pleasures of the cabin. Hiking through the woods, cooking meals together, playing board games late into the night. They still had moments of awkwardness, moments where the old habits tried to resurface. But something was different. There was an openness now, a willingness to be honest with each other. One evening, as they sat around the fire pit, Thomas spoke up again, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know how we got here. I don't know how I became the kind of father who was always so focused on the wrong things. But I'm going to try. I'm going to try to be better, to be the kind of father you both deserve." Margaret placed her hand on his, her eyes soft with understanding. "And I'm going to try to stop pretending that everything is fine when it's not." Daniel looked at them, his usual defiance softened. replaced with something else. A recognition of the change, of the effort being made. "I don't expect everything to change overnight," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "But maybe, just maybe, we can start over. We can figure this out together." It wasn't a perfect moment. Nothing ever was. But it was real. And for Sarah, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, things slowly began to shift. The family continued to work on their relationships, one conversation at a time. There were setbacks, of course. Old patterns of avoidance and silence crept in from time to time. But the difference now was that they recognized it. They acknowledged it, and they worked through it. Sarah, for the first time in years, felt like she was truly part of a family. Not the perfect family she had once imagined, but a real family, imperfect, flawed, but united in their willingness to grow together. She had learned something powerful in those weeks. Something that had taken her a long time to understand. The strength of a family isn't in its perfection. It's in its ability to come together, to face the hard truths, to break down the walls of silence, and to choose to love each other despite everything. It's in the moments when they let go of the expectations and simply allow themselves to be who they are, flaws and all. And as Sarah sat by the fire with her family that night, she knew, deep down, that they were on the right path. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. Because this time, they weren't pretending anymore. They were real. And that was enough. The months that followed the family trip marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Johnsons, one that was less about perfection and more about understanding. Sarah often found herself reflecting on how much had changed, how far they had come from the tense and fractured family that had sat around the dinner table just a few months ago. But despite the progress, she knew that their journey was not over. Rebuilding a family wasn't a destination. It was a continual process, one that required patience, understanding, and the willingness to show up every day, no matter how hard it got. It was a chilly autumn evening when Sarah sat down with her mother in the kitchen, the two of them preparing dinner together. The quiet hum of the oven was the only sound between them, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables marking the steady passage of time. Margaret had always been the heart of their home, the one who kept everything together with her warmth and grace. But now, Sarah was beginning to see her differently, not as a perfect mother, but as a woman who, like herself, was learning to navigate the messiness of life. "Do you remember when we used to talk about everything, Mom?" Sarah asked as she stirred a pot on the stove. Margaret paused, her knife halfway through slicing a carrot. She looked at Sarah, her eyes softening. "Of course I do. You were just a little girl back then, and everything seemed so much simpler. We had time to talk about anything and everything." "I miss that," Sarah said quietly. "I miss feeling like we could talk about the big stuff without it feeling so awkward." "I miss it too," Margaret admitted, her voice tinged with regret. "I think I got so caught up in trying to make everything perfect that I lost sight of what really mattered. I thought if everything looked good on the outside, it would somehow make us happy. But I see now that it's not about perfection. It's about being real." Sarah smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I've been learning that too. I think we all have." Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I wish I had known earlier. I wish I had realized sooner that trying to make everything perfect doesn't bring happiness. It just builds walls." The conversation hung in the air, not with sadness, but with the kind of understanding that only comes after shared pain and growth. Sarah reached out and placed her hand over her mother's, a gesture of connection that felt more genuine than anything they had shared in the past. It wasn't about fixing everything, about making it all better overnight. It was about accepting the imperfections, the mistakes, and the things they couldn't change, and learning to live with them, together. Meanwhile, Daniel, who had been more distant in recent weeks, seemed to be slowly coming to terms with his own feelings. There were still moments of rebellion, moments when he retreated into himself. But Sarah could see the small changes. He was no longer running from the family, no longer acting out to push them away. Instead, he was quietly seeking out moments of connection, small conversations, a shared laugh, a lingering look that spoke volumes. One evening, Daniel sat down beside Sarah on the couch after dinner, something he hadn't done in a long time. He didn't say anything at first, just fiddled with his phone, as though unsure of what to say. But Sarah could tell that something was on his mind. You know? He started, his voice almost hesitant. I've been thinking about what you said before, about not pretending anymore. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Yeah? What about it? I think I've been pretending too, he admitted, looking down at his hands. I've been pretending that I don't care, that I don't want to be a part of this family, but the truth is I do. I want to be seen. I just didn't know how to let myself be seen. Sarah didn't know what to say at first. The words she had longed to hear were finally coming from Daniel's mouth, but she didn't want to push him, didn't want to rush it. Instead, she simply reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. I see you, Daniel, she said quietly. I always have, and I'm glad you're here. He smiled at her, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. It wasn't the smile of the rebellious teenager who was constantly pushing against everything. It was the smile of someone who had found a little peace, someone who was beginning to understand himself and his place in the family. And for the first time in years, Sarah felt a sense of relief settle over her. The walls between them were beginning to crumble, and the family she had once thought was beyond repair was finally coming back together. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but that was okay. Perfection wasn't the goal anymore. Realness, honesty, and love were. It was during the winter holidays when Sarah, Margaret, Thomas, and Daniel gathered around the living room, their first Christmas together as a family that had truly confronted its struggles. The tree stood in the corner, adorned with ornaments that seemed to tell the story of their past, both the happy moments and the difficult ones. The stockings hung by the fireplace, not perfectly arranged, but filled with the love and care that come to define their family over the past few months. Sarah felt the warmth of the fire as she sat beside her family, her heart full. There were no pretenses, no perfect images to uphold. There was just the quiet comfort of being together. It was enough. This is nice, Daniel said quietly, his voice almost thoughtful as he looked around the room. It was the first time he had said something like that without the usual edge of sarcasm or bitterness. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was the acknowledgement of how far they had come, the understanding that, for the first time in a long time, they were truly present with each other. I think we're doing okay, Sarah said, looking at her parents. We're not perfect, but we're here. We're together. Margaret smiled at her daughter, her face soft with emotion. We're here. And that's what matters? Thomas, who had been quiet for most of the evening, cleared his throat and looked at his family. I know I've made mistakes. I've been distant, and I've tried to keep everything under control. But I'm not going to try to fix everything anymore. I'm going to be here, for all of you. Sarah could see the sincerity in her father's eyes, and for the first time, she didn't feel the need to defend herself, didn't feel the weight of expectations pressing down on her. She simply nodded, her heart full of gratitude for the family she had, imperfect as it was. In that moment, Sarah realized that they had finally done it. They had broken down the walls that had divided them for so long. It wasn't about having all the answers or fixing all the problems. It was about showing up for each other, about being present in the moments that mattered. It was about love in its most honest and vulnerable form. As the evening wore on, they sat together, talking and laughing as the snow fell softly outside. The world outside was cold and dark, but inside their home there was warmth. There was love. There was family. And for the first time in years, Sarah knew that this was enough. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was all that mattered. Their journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more moments of struggle, but they had learned how to face them together. And that, Sarah realized, was the true strength of a family. The end of one story is only the beginning of another. And for the Johnsons, their story was only just beginning. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe and like the video.